Eleanor Whitfield descended from the dusty stagecoach expecting to meet a weathered rancher seeking companionship. Instead, two barefoot boys with haunted eyes stared up at her like she was a ghost that might vanish if they blinked. "Are you the mail order woman?" the eldest asked, his voice carrying the weight of too many disappointments. Eleanor's carpetbag slipped from her trembling fingers as she realized the truth. She hadn't come to marry a man. She'd come to save a family that was already broken. Behind them stood a hollow-eyed rancher who looked like he'd forgotten how to hope, and a ranch house that seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see if she would run. Before we begin this journey across the Wyoming frontier, I invite you to stay with me until the very end of this story. If it touches your heart, please leave a like and comment with your city so I can see how far Eleanor's story travels across the world. The September sun beat mercilessly on the roof of the overland stage as it rocked its way across the Wyoming territory, each jolt sending clouds of alkali dust through the leather window flaps. Eleanor Whitfield pressed a handkerchief to her nose and tried to ignore the way her corset dug into her ribs with every bump. Across from her, a prospector dozed with his hat pulled low, and beside her a minister's wife clutched a Bible like it might shield her from the wilderness itself. Eleanor had no such comfort. Only a worn carpetbag at her feet and a carefully folded letter in her reticule, a letter that had changed everything. Seeking respectable woman of good character for companionship and assistance with household. 2 sons, ages 7 and 9. Ranch situated in Sweetwater Valley. Correspondence welcomed. Nathan Hale. That had been 4 months ago. 4 months of letters exchanged between Boston and Wyoming, each one revealing a little more. His wife had died 2 years prior. The boys were struggling. The ranch needed a woman's touch. Eleanor had written of her own losses, a teaching position lost when the school closed, parents gone, no siblings, no prospects. She'd been honest about her situation, and he'd been honest about his needs, or so she'd thought. The stage lurched to a stop, and the driver's voice rang out, "Sweetwater Station, 15-minute rest, folks." Eleanor's heart hammered as she smoothed her traveling dress and gathered her belongings. Through the dust-caked window, she could see a weathered building that served as both station and mercantile, a water trough, and beyond that, nothing. Just endless prairie rolling toward distant mountains, the grass already browning in the late summer heat. She stepped down carefully, her city boots finding uncertain purchase in the rutted earth. The air smelled of sage and dust and something else, something vast and untamed that made her chest tighten with equal parts fear and strange exhilaration. "Miss Whitfield?" The voice was young, uncertain. Eleanor turned to find not the rancher she'd expected, but 2 boys standing beside a weathered wagon. They were thin as fence posts, their clothes patched but clean, their feet bare despite the rough ground. The older one held the wagon's reins with white-knuckled intensity. The younger one stared at her with eyes too serious for a child. "Are you the mail-order woman?" the older boy asked, and something in his voice made Eleanor's throat tight. It wasn't quite hope. Hope would have been easier. This was something more fragile. This was the sound of a child who'd learned not to hope at all. Eleanor's carefully prepared greeting died on her lips. She'd spent the entire journey rehearsing what she'd say to Nathan Hale, how she'd present herself as capable and worthy. She hadn't prepared for this, for 2 barefoot boys with guarded eyes and voices that expected disappointment. She set down her carpetbag and did something her Boston upbringing would have deemed improper. She knelt in the dust, bringing herself to their eye level, heedless of her skirts. "My name is Eleanor," she said quietly. "Eleanor Whitfield. And yes, I came here to meet your father. Might I know your names?" The boys exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, the older one spoke. "I'm James. This is Thomas. Pa sent us because the south fence broke again, and he had to fix it before the cattle got out." "He said to tell you he's real sorry," Thomas added quickly, as if his father's absence might send her running back to the stage. "He wanted to come himself, but the cattle don't care about company arriving," Eleanor finished gently. "I understand. Ranching waits for no one." James's shoulders dropped slightly, some tension easing. "You know about ranching?" "Not a thing," Eleanor admitted. "But I know about responsibility. And I know that sometimes the important things can't wait, no matter how much we might wish they could." She rose, brushing dust from her skirts, and retrieved her carpet bag. "Shall we go? I imagine you both have chores waiting, and I've taken enough of your afternoon." The boys loaded her trunk onto the wagon bed with surprising efficiency, their movements practiced and careful. Eleanor climbed up to the seat, and James clicked to the horses. The wagon lurched forward, leaving Sweetwater Station behind. The silence stretched as they traveled, broken only by the creak of wheels and the rhythmic plod of hooves. The land unfolded around them in shades of gold and brown, broken by outcroppings of red rock and the occasional twisted juniper. In the distance, the Wind River Range rose like a promise or a warning, snow already dusting the highest peaks. "Pa says you're from Boston," Thomas ventured finally, from where he sat squeezed between Eleanor and his brother. "Is it true you lived in a house with 3 floors?" "4, actually," Eleanor said, "though I only had a small room on the top floor. I was a teacher, and I lived in the boarding house where many teachers stayed." "Why'd you leave?" James asked, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. It was a fair question, though a complicated one. Eleanor considered how to answer, how much truth these boys could handle, how much they needed to hear. "The school closed when the neighborhood changed," she said finally, "and I found myself at a crossroads. I could seek another position in another city, or I could take a chance on something entirely different. Your father's letter arrived at just the right moment, or perhaps just the right wrong moment. Sometimes those are the same thing." "You mean you had nowhere else to go?" James said flatly. Eleanor felt the sting of his words, but she heard the fear beneath them. He wasn't being cruel. He was testing her, seeing if she'd lie. "I had options," she said carefully, "but none that felt like a choice worth making. Coming here felt like the first real choice I'd made in a very long time. Does that make sense?" James was quiet for a long moment. "I guess." They crested a low rise, and suddenly the ranch spread before them. It wasn't much. A low house with a covered porch, a barn weathered silver by wind and sun, a collection of outbuildings and corrals. A thin stream wound through the property, marked by a line of cottonwoods just beginning to turn gold. Cattle dotted the distant slopes, and a single figure worked at a fence line, too far away to make out clearly. But what struck Eleanor most was how it all seemed to be holding its breath. The house looked clean, but somehow hollow. The yard was tidy, but joyless. Even the way the boys sat up straighter as they approached told her this wasn't a home. It was a place where people survived. "That's Pa," Thomas said quietly, pointing toward the figure at the fence. "He'll come up soon as he finishes that section." James drove the wagon right up to the house and set the brake with practiced ease. Before Eleanor could gather her skirts to climb down, both boys had jumped off and were hauling her trunk toward the porch with determined silence. "The blue room's yours," James called over his shoulder. "End of the hall. Pa cleaned it up special." Eleanor followed them inside, and the house's emptiness struck her immediately. The main room was neat, almost painfully so, but devoid of any warmth. No pictures on the walls, no quilts draped over the furniture, no books scattered about or projects in progress. It was a house scrubbed clean of personality, as if someone had tried to erase all evidence of who'd once lived there. The blue room was small but bright, with a window overlooking the stream and a simple iron bed covered in a faded quilt. Her trunk sat at its foot, and a pitcher of water waited on the washstand. "There's water if you want to freshen up," James said from the doorway. "Supper's at 6. Pa does the cooking mostly, but Thomas and me help." "Thank you, James. And Thomas." Eleanor turned to face them both. "I appreciate you coming to fetch me. It was very responsible." James nodded shortly and turned to go, but Thomas lingered, something working in his expression. "Did you really not turn back?" he asked suddenly. "When you saw it was just us at the station?" Eleanor's heart cracked. "No, sweetheart, I didn't turn back." "Why not?" She considered the question carefully. "Because I said I would come. And because 2 boys brave enough to meet a stranger with bare feet and honest questions deserve someone who keeps her word." Thomas's eyes widened slightly. Then, without another word, he darted after his brother, his footsteps echoing through the hollow house. Eleanor sank onto the bed and pressed her hands to her face. What had she walked into? The letters had mentioned his wife's death, the boy's need for stability, the ranch requiring management. They hadn't mentioned this careful emptiness, this sense of a family going through motions they no longer believed in. Through the window, she could see the figure at the fence finally gather his tools and head toward the house. Even from this distance, she could tell Nathan Hale was a man carrying weight that had nothing to do with the tools on his shoulder. Eleanor poured water into the basin and washed the dust from her face and hands. She smoothed her hair, straightened her collar, and studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. At 32, she was past the age when most women worried about first impressions with potential husbands. Her face was pleasant but unremarkable, her figure sensible, her manner practical. She'd never been the kind of woman men wrote poetry about, and she'd made peace with that long ago. But now, standing in this silent house, she wondered if Nathan Hale had been hoping for something she couldn't provide. Something younger, prettier, less worn by disappointment. Heavy footsteps sounded on the porch, followed by the scrape of boots being cleaned. Eleanor took a breath and smoothed her skirts one more time. When she emerged into the main room, Nathan Hale stood with his back to her, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. He was tall, lean to the point of gauntness, his shoulders broad but somehow defeated. When he turned, his face matched his posture, handsome in a weathered way but carrying exhaustion in every line. "Miss Whitfield?" His voice was rough from disuse or dust or both. "I apologize for not meeting you at the station myself. The fence—" "The boys explained," Eleanor said, "and it's quite all right. They were perfect gentlemen." Something flickered in Nathan's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or relief. "They're good boys. Better than I deserve, probably." The statement hung awkwardly between them. Eleanor had expected many things from this first meeting, awkwardness certainly, perhaps formal politeness or practical discussion of arrangements. She hadn't expected defeat. "Mr. Hale—" "Nathan," he said quickly, "if we're to be married, seems foolish to stand on formality." "Nathan, then, and you should call me Eleanor." She folded her hands. "I think perhaps we should sit down and speak plainly. There seems to be a great deal that letters couldn't convey." Nathan's jaw tightened, but he nodded and gestured to the table. They sat across from each other like adversaries at a negotiation, and Eleanor was struck by how different this was from the correspondence that had brought her here. On paper, Nathan had seemed thoughtful, even occasionally warm. In person, he was walled off, every word carefully measured. "The boys said you're a teacher," he started. "Was. The school closed." "Right. You mentioned that." He rubbed a hand over his face. "I'm not good at this. I should probably tell you that straight off. Sarah, my wife. She was the one who knew how to talk to people, make them feel welcome. I'm just—" He gestured vaguely. "I work. I keep things running, or I try to." "The ranch," Eleanor prompted gently. 2,000 acres, give or take, cattle mostly, some horses. It was Sarah's family's land originally. Her father gave it to us when we married." His voice had gone flat, reciting facts like they were someone else's story. "The boys were born here. She died here." "I'm sorry." "Everyone's sorry." The words came out harder than he'd probably intended, and Nathan winced. "I don't mean... It's just that sorry doesn't fix anything. Sorry doesn't teach James to read past a primer level. Sorry doesn't stop Thomas from having nightmares. Sorry doesn't—" He stopped himself. "I'm making a hash of this." "You're being honest," Eleanor said quietly, "which is more than many would manage." Nathan met her eyes for the first time since she'd entered the room, and Eleanor saw something there that made her want to weep. Not anger or grief, though both were present. What she saw was simply exhaustion, the kind that came from carrying too much for too long with no rest in sight. "I need help," he said finally. "That's the truth of it. I need someone who can manage the house, to teach the boys, handle the things I'm too damn tired to handle anymore. I need—" His voice cracked slightly. "I need someone to care whether we make it or not, because I'm about out of caring, and that's terrifying." The confession seemed to cost him. He looked away, his jaw working. Eleanor sat very still, letting his words settle. This wasn't what she'd expected. This raw honesty, this admission of need so profound it bordered on desperation. But perhaps it was exactly what she needed to hear, because it meant the letters hadn't lied about the important things. It meant Nathan Hale, for all his rough edges and exhaustion, was still a man who could ask for help, Who could admit he was drowning? Then we understand each other, she said finally, because I need a place to belong. Not just a position or a situation. I need somewhere I can build something real. The last 5 years of my life have been spent in temporary quarters, teaching children I had to leave behind at the end of each term, making do with borrowed furniture and other people's cast-offs. I'm 32 years old, Nathan. I'm tired of temporary. This isn't some romantic adventure, Nathan warned. It's hard work and early mornings and never quite enough money. It's boys who've forgotten how to laugh in a house that hasn't felt like a home in 2 years. It's a chance, Eleanor interrupted. It's a chance to build something that matters. That's more than I had in Boston. Nathan studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor held his gaze steadily. She wouldn't pretend this would be easy, but she wouldn't let him scare her away either. The boys like you, he said finally. Thomas doesn't trust easily, and James is too busy being the man of the house at 9 years old. But they came back from the station different, lighter, maybe, like they'd been holding their breath and could finally exhale. They asked me if I turned back when I saw it was just them, Eleanor said. What did they expect? Nathan's face tightened. The last woman I wrote to before you, she did turn back, took one look at 2 dusty boys and a ranch that needed work and climbed right back on the stage. Didn't even come out to see the place, just said she'd changed her mind and went back east. Eleanor felt anger kindle in her chest, not at Nathan, but at the woman who'd looked at 2 hopeful boys and chosen to leave them standing in the dust. I see. So when you didn't run, when you got in that wagon and let them bring you here, that meant something, to them anyway. Nathan rose abruptly, as if he'd said too much. Supper in an hour. Boys will help with the cooking. You should rest. He was gone before Eleanor could respond, the door closing firmly behind him. She heard his voice in the yard calling to James about evening chores and the immediate bustle of activity that followed. Eleanor sat alone in the silent house and tried to gather her thoughts. This was so much more complicated than she'd anticipated. Not a simple arrangement of mutual benefit, but a family barely holding together, waiting to see if she'd be the solution or just another disappointment. Through the window, she watched Nathan and James move toward the barn, their movements synchronized from long practice. Thomas appeared from around the house, carrying a bucket of eggs with careful concentration. They moved like soldiers in a campaign, efficient, purposeful, but joyless. Eleanor rose and moved to the kitchen, noting the careful organization, the sparse but clean supplies, the cast-iron stove that was clearly well-maintained but rarely used for anything beyond basic sustenance. She found flour, salt, a crock of sourdough starter that someone was keeping alive, dried apples, a small store of spices. When Thomas returned with the eggs, he stopped short at finding her there. I thought I might help with supper, Eleanor said. If you'll show me where things are kept. Thomas set the bucket on the counter carefully. Pa usually makes biscuits and beans, sometimes bacon if we have it. How do you feel about apple pandowdy? Eleanor asked. It's a sort of cobbler. My mother used to make it when she wanted the house to smell like autumn. Thomas's eyes widened. We haven't had cobbler since... He stopped himself. Since a long time ago. Then perhaps it's time we had it again. Will you help me? For the next hour, Eleanor and Thomas worked side by side in the kitchen. The boy was hesitant at first, uncertain of this stranger giving him direction, but he knew where everything was kept and was surprisingly capable with a knife when she set him to slicing apples. As they worked, the house began to smell of cinnamon and butter, and something in the air seemed to shift, just slightly but noticeably. James appeared in the doorway when the pandowdy was nearly done, drawn by the scent. He said nothing, but his eyes tracked every movement as Eleanor checked the oven. Would you set the table, James? Eleanor asked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I think we're about 10 minutes from eating. He hesitated, then moved to comply. Eleanor noticed he set 4 places, not 3, and felt a small measure of hope. Nathan came in last, washing at the pump by the door, his hair damp and his face clean, but still carrying that bone-deep weariness. He froze when he saw the table, set properly with a cloth Eleanor had found in a drawer, plates arranged just so, and in the center, the pandowdy steaming gently. Thomas helped me, Eleanor said quietly. I hope you don't mind. I wanted to contribute something my first night here. Nathan stared at the table like it was a mirage that might disappear. When he spoke, his voice was rough. It's been a long time since this table looked like that. They sat awkwardly at first, no one quite sure how to begin. But the food was good, simple but comforting, and gradually something like conversation emerged. Thomas told Eleanor about the chickens and which ones were the best layers. James explained the ranch's boundary lines and the constant battle with the fences. Nathan added details when prompted, but mostly he watched Eleanor interact with his sons, watched them respond to her questions, watched the house slowly come back to something resembling life. "This is real good, Miss Eleanor," Thomas said, around a mouthful of pandowdy. "Best thing I've had in forever." "Thomas, mind your manners," Nathan said automatically, but without heat. "It's quite all right," Eleanor said. "And I'm glad you like it, Thomas. Perhaps tomorrow you can show me the chickens properly, and you can tell me which eggs came from which hens." Thomas nodded eagerly, already planning his tour, and Eleanor caught Nathan watching her with something unreadable in his expression. After supper, the boys cleared the table without being asked, another sign of habits drilled in by necessity, and Nathan stepped outside to check on the stock one final time. Eleanor washed dishes at the pump, noting how the ranch settled into evening. The last light painted the mountains gold, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed contentedly. "Miss Eleanor?" Thomas appeared at her elbow, holding a worn book. "Pa usually reads to us before bed, but he's been too tired lately. Could you, maybe—" "I'd be honored," Eleanor said, drying her hands. "What are we reading?" "Treasure Island," James answered, appearing with his brother. "We're on Chapter 8, but we can start over if you want." "Chapter 8 is perfect. Shall we sit on the porch? The evening's lovely." They settled on the porch steps, Eleanor on the top, the boys below her, and she began to read in the fading light. Her voice carried across the quiet yard, bringing pirates and adventure to this lonely corner of Wyoming. The boys leaned against the railing, utterly absorbed, and Eleanor felt something ease in her chest. This, at least, she could give them. This moment of normalcy, of childhood wonder, of someone caring enough to read aloud in the twilight. Nathan returned to find them there, his sons entranced, this stranger's voice weaving stories into the evening air. He stood in the shadows, listening, and Eleanor saw him wipe at his eyes when he thought no one was watching. When she finished the chapter, both boys groaned at stopping. "Tomorrow," Eleanor promised. "If your father approves, we'll read another chapter tomorrow evening." "Pa?" James turned hopefully to Nathan. "I approve," Nathan said quietly. "But now it's time for bed. You've got chores early." The boys said goodnight, properly, Eleanor noted, with genuine warmth, and disappeared inside. Their footsteps echoed overhead as they climbed to the loft. Nathan and Eleanor stood alone in the gathering darkness, the awkwardness returning now that the boys' presence no longer buffered them. "They haven't asked for a story in months," Nathan said finally. "I told myself they'd outgrown it, but they hadn't. I was just too tired to notice they still needed it." "Children are resilient," Eleanor said, "but they shouldn't have to be, not all the time." Nathan's jaw tightened. "I'm doing the best I can." "I know you are. I didn't mean—" Eleanor caught herself. "I'm sorry, that came out wrong. What I meant was that you've been doing this alone for too long. It's too much for one person. And you think you can fix it?" The challenge in his voice was tired rather than angry. "Come in here and make everything better just by reading stories and baking cobbler?" "No," Eleanor said honestly. "I think we might be able to fix it together, if you're willing to try." Nathan was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "I brought you here under false pretenses. You should know that." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "The ranch. It's—" He stopped, started again. "We're not failing exactly, but we're not succeeding either. Every season it's harder. Every year I'm more in debt. I told myself I'd turn it around before you arrived, that I'd have things on solid ground. But I haven't, and now you're here, and you deserve to know what you're walking into." "Why didn't you say this in your letters?" "Because I was afraid you wouldn't come, and I—" His voice cracked. "I needed you to come. The boys needed you to come. I know that's not fair. I know I should have been honest, but I was desperate." Eleanor absorbed this, her mind racing. She'd suspected the ranch was struggling. The careful economy of the household, the boys' worn clothes, Nathan's exhaustion all pointed to a family barely keeping their head above water. But hearing him admit it, hearing the desperation beneath the words, changed something. "Are we in danger of losing the ranch?" she asked bluntly. Nathan flinched. "There's a payment due in 3 months. If the cattle contract comes through, we'll make it. If it doesn't—" He spread his hands helplessly. "And if it doesn't? Then we lose everything. The land, the house, everything Sarah's family built. And the boys, they'd have nothing. I'd have nothing to give them." The weight of it settled over Eleanor like a physical thing. She'd come here seeking stability, a place to belong, and instead she'd walked into a family on the edge of collapse. Every instinct screamed at her to protect herself, to leave before she got pulled under with them. But when she closed her eyes, she saw Thomas carefully slicing apples, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. She saw James setting the table with a cloth he'd pulled from a drawer, trying to make things nice. She saw Nathan's face when he'd come in and found supper waiting, that moment of naked longing for something he'd thought was gone forever. "I'm not going to lie to you," she said slowly. "This isn't what I expected, and I'm frightened. I came here looking for security, and you're telling me there might not be any." "I know, and if you want to leave, I'll pay your fare back to Boston. Let me finish," Eleanor interrupted. "I'm frightened, but I'm also tired of running from difficulty. Tired of choosing the safe path only to find it wasn't safe at all. So I have a question for you, Nathan Hale. Are you willing to fight for this ranch? For your sons? For the life you want to build?" Nathan stared at her. "What? Are you willing to fight? Or have you already given up?" "I haven't given up," he said, anger finally breaking through the exhaustion. "I work myself to the bone every day. I do everything I can. Alone," Eleanor said. "You do everything alone. You carry it all yourself and wonder why you can't make it work. But you didn't bring me here to be a housekeeper, Nathan. You brought me here to be a partner. So let me partner with you. Tell me everything, every debt, every deadline, every option we have. And let's decide together how we're going to save this ranch." The silence stretched between them, and Eleanor held her breath. This was the moment, the point where he'd either let her in or push her away, where they'd become a team or remain strangers sharing a house. "Together," Nathan said finally, testing the word. I'm not sure I know how to do that anymore." "Neither do I," Eleanor admitted. "But I think we'd better learn quickly, because we have 3 months, Nathan. 3 months to save everything, and we can't do it if we're not honest with each other." Nathan nodded slowly, something like hope, fragile and uncertain, flickering in his eyes. "Tomorrow. I'll show you the books tomorrow. Show you everything." "Good." Eleanor rose, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was from the journey. "And Nathan? Thank you for trusting me with the truth, even if it came later than it should have." She moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. Those boys in there? They need to know you haven't given up. They need to see you fight, because they're watching everything you do, learning how to face their own battles from how you face yours. Don't teach them that the weight of the world is something you carry alone until it crushes you. Teach them that asking for help is the bravest thing a person can do." She left him standing in the darkness, her words hanging in the night air. In the blue room, Eleanor unpacked her few belongings by lamplight, her hands trembling slightly. She'd just committed to something terrifying, pledged herself to a failing ranch and a broken family with no guarantee of success. It was reckless. It was foolish. It was the first time in years she'd felt truly alive. Through the thin walls, she could hear the boys settling down, their whispered conversation too low to make out. Above, Nathan's footsteps moved across the loft, heavy and slow. This house full of people who barely knew each other, thrown together by necessity and desperation. Eleanor climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling, watching shadows cast by her lamp dance across the rough-hewn beams. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more challenges, more reasons to doubt this choice. But tonight, in this moment, she'd made her decision. She was the woman who stayed. Eleanor woke to the sound of roosters and the pale gray light of dawn filtering through her window. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar room and the silence that was somehow louder than any city noise. Then memory flooded back. The ranch, the boys, Nathan's confession about the debt. And she rose quickly, splashing cold water on her face from the pitcher. The house was already stirring. She could hear footsteps overhead and the creak of the ladder as someone descended from the loft. By the time she dressed and pinned her hair into a practical bun, the smell of coffee was drifting through the house. Nathan stood at the stove when she emerged, pouring grounds into a battered pot. He looked like he hadn't slept, dark circles shadowing his eyes, but his movements were precise and practiced. "Morning," he said without turning. "Coffee'll be ready in a few minutes. Boys are seeing to the stock." "What can I do?" Eleanor asked, moving to stand beside him. The kitchen felt smaller with both of them in it, and she was acutely aware of the careful distance he maintained. "You don't have to—" "Nathan," she kept her voice gentle but firm. "We agreed. Partners, remember? Now, what needs doing?" He studied her for a moment, as if checking to see if she meant it. Whatever he saw in her face seemed to satisfy him. "Breakfast. The boys will be hungry when they come in. Eggs, if you're willing. There's bacon in the larder, but we're running low." Eleanor set to work, grateful for something concrete to occupy her hands. They moved around each other in the small space with surprising ease, Nathan tending the coffee while she cracked eggs into a bowl and sliced bacon. Through the window, she could see James and Thomas crossing the yard, their breath visible in the morning chill. "About last night," Nathan started, then stopped. "About what I told you, we'll look at the books after breakfast," Eleanor said. "Like you promised. But right now, let's just get through the morning, one thing at a time." Relief flickered across his face. "One thing at a time. I can do that." The boys burst through the door with all the noise and energy of young animals, bringing the smell of the barn and the outdoors with them. They washed at the pump and threw themselves into chairs, eyeing the breakfast Eleanor was plating with undisguised interest. "Sleep well, Miss Eleanor?" Thomas asked, watching as she set a plate in front of him. "Very well, thank you. Though your roosters are more reliable than any alarm clock I've ever owned." James snorted. "That's old Red. He's mean as a snake and twice as loud. Pa keeps saying he's going to make him into soup." "I keep hoping he'll get the message and quiet down," Nathan said, taking his seat. "But he's too stubborn." "Maybe he's just doing his job," Eleanor offered, sitting down with her own plate, making sure nobody sleeps through chores. It was such a simple moment, 4 people eating breakfast together, but Eleanor felt the significance of it. This was what Nathan had been missing, what the boys had been craving. Not fancy meals or perfect housekeeping, but the simple rhythm of family. Someone to share the morning with, to talk about roosters and chores, and nothing important at all. After breakfast, Nathan sent the boys off to their tasks with specific instructions about mending fence and checking water levels. When they'd gone, he turned to Eleanor with visible reluctance. "I suppose we should get this over with," he said. "The books are in the desk. I warn you, they're not pretty." The desk sat in the corner of the main room, a simple piece of furniture that had clearly once been fine, but was now scarred and battered. Nathan pulled out a leather-bound ledger and spread it on the table, his jaw tight. Eleanor sat and began to read. The entries were meticulous. Nathan clearly had a head for numbers, but the story they told was bleak. Income from cattle sales, carefully recorded, expenses for feed, equipment, repairs. A column labeled medical, with dates that corresponded to his wife's final illness. Another labeled funeral, and at the bottom, a loan payment schedule that made Eleanor's stomach clench. "The bank holds a note on the land," Nathan explained, his voice flat. "Sarah's father took it out to expand the herd 5 years ago. Thought we'd pay it off easy with the cattle prices high, but then—" He gestured helplessly. "Prices dropped. Sarah got sick. By the time she died, we'd burned through most of our reserve just keeping her comfortable. How much do you owe?" $1,500. Payment of $500 due November 15th. Eleanor's breath caught. It was an enormous sum, more than most people saw in years. "And your income?" "We've got a contract with the fort that should pay $800 if it comes through, but it's dependent on the cattle being delivered by mid-November, and we're short on hands to drive them. I can't do it alone, and the boys are too young. I'd need to hire at least 2 drovers, which cuts into profit. So even if the contract comes through, you'd barely make the payment." "Barely." Nathan rubbed his face. "And there's no guarantee. The fort's talking about sourcing their beef from a supplier in Colorado who can deliver cheaper. If they cancel our contract, he didn't need to finish. Eleanor could see it all laid out in the merciless columns of numbers. One wrong turn, one bit of bad luck, and they'd lose everything. What about selling some of the land, she asked. Already mortgaged, can't sell what the bank owns. Equipment? Stock you could spare? We're running lean as it is. If I sell the plow, how do I put in crops come spring? If I sell cattle, I don't have enough to fill the contract. Eleanor sat back, her mind racing through possibilities and discarding them just as quickly. Every angle seemed blocked, every option already exhausted. Nathan had clearly been over this ground 1,000 times, looking for a way out that didn't exist. There has to be something, she said finally, some option we're not seeing. If there is, I haven't found it. Nathan's voice was hollow. And I've looked, Eleanor. I've been looking for 2 years. There's no miracle coming. We're just... He stopped, his control finally cracking. We're just going to lose it. And I don't know how to tell the boys. I don't know how to tell them I failed them. Eleanor reached across the table and gripped his hand. He flinched at the contact but didn't pull away. You haven't failed them. You've kept this place running through grief and impossible circumstances. That's not failure. It is if we lose the ranch. The ranch isn't what makes you their father. It's not what makes them a family. She squeezed his hand. But we're not going to lose it. Not without a fight. Eleanor, I have some money, she said quickly. Not much, but it's something. $200 I saved from my teaching salary. It's yours. Nathan jerked his hand back as if burned. Absolutely not. I didn't bring you here to rob you blind. You didn't bring me here at all. I chose to come. And I choose to invest this money in our future. That's what partners do, Nathan. They share resources. $200 isn't enough to save us. No, but it's a start. It buys us time to find other solutions. Eleanor stood and began pacing, her mind working. We need to increase income and decrease expenses. What can we sell that won't hurt the operation? There's nothing... Nathan, stop. Eleanor turned to face him. Stop telling me what we can't do and start thinking about what we can do. You've been alone in this so long you've convinced yourself there are no options. But there are always options. We just have to be creative. He stared at her, and slowly something shifted in his expression. Not quite hope, but at least willingness to try. All right, what do you suggest? I don't know yet, but let's start by listing everything we have. Not just the big things, everything. Sometimes the answer is in the details you've overlooked because you've been too focused on the impossible problems. For the next hour, they went through every aspect of the ranch. Eleanor took notes in careful script, asking questions Nathan had never considered important. How many eggs did the chickens produce? Were there wild berries on the property? What about the stream? Could they catch fish? Did the cottonwoods along the water produce anything usable? I don't see how knowing we have 30 laying hens helps with a $1,500 debt, Nathan said finally, frustration creeping into his voice. Maybe it doesn't. But maybe knowing we have a surplus of eggs means I can bake goods to sell in town. Maybe those cottonwoods can be tapped for syrup or harvested for wood. Maybe... Eleanor stopped, an idea forming. Nathan, when you drive the cattle to the fort, what route do you take? Through Sweetwater Station, then north along the main trail. Why? How many days? 4 if the weather holds. And in those 4 days, where do the drovers typically eat? Nathan frowned, not seeing where she was going. They bring supplies, bacon, beans, coffee. Same as any trail drive. But what if someone offered them fresh-baked bread? Real meals instead of trail rations? What if there was a way to make that drive more bearable and charge for the service? You want to cook for drovers? Nathan sounded incredulous. I want to think beyond the obvious. Eleanor leaned forward. We're assuming this ranch has to survive on cattle alone. But what if we diversify? What if we offer services other ranches don't? You said yourself you need to hire drovers. What if instead of hiring strangers, we partnered with another small ranch in similar straits? Shared labor, shared expenses. Nobody partners in ranching, every man for himself out here. Why? Because that's how it's always been done? Eleanor challenged. Maybe that's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps small ranches struggling while the big operations swallow them up. Maybe it's time to try something different. Nathan was quiet, and Eleanor could see him wrestling with the idea. It went against everything he knew, every instinct he'd developed. But desperation had a way of opening minds to new possibilities. Even if I could find someone willing, he said slowly, that doesn't solve the immediate problem. We still need $500 in 3 months. No, we need to show the bank we're making progress. We need to demonstrate that this ranch is viable, and we're taking steps to improve it. Eleanor tapped her notes. What if we present them with a business plan? Show them we're not just hoping for the best, but actively working to turn things around. Banks don't care about plans. They care about money. Banks care about protecting their investment. If they foreclose, they get land, but they have to manage it or sell it. If we can show them we have a path to success, they might extend the loan. Eleanor paused. It's worth trying, isn't it? What do we have to lose? Nathan laughed, but there was no humor in it. Everything. We have everything to lose. We have everything to lose if we do nothing, Eleanor corrected. If we try and fail, we're no worse off. But if we try and succeed, then maybe my sons get to keep their home. Nathan's voice cracked on the last word, and Eleanor saw him struggling to maintain composure. Maybe they don't grow up knowing their father couldn't protect what mattered. You're protecting them right now, Eleanor said softly, by fighting, by not giving up. That's what they need to see. A sound at the door made them both turn. James stood in the doorway, his face pale, Thomas beside him. From the looks of them, they'd heard at least part of the conversation. Pa? James's voice was carefully controlled, but Eleanor could hear the fear beneath it. Are we going to lose the ranch? Nathan's face went white. Boys, We heard you and Miss Eleanor talking. James stepped inside, his shoulders squared like he was bracing for a blow. About the debt and the bank. Are we going to lose our home? The silence stretched painfully. Eleanor could see Nathan struggling with whether to lie, to protect them, or to trust them with the truth. Finally, he sighed and gestured to the table. Sit down, both of you. The boys sat, their eyes wide and frightened. Nathan looked at Eleanor, and she gave a small nod of encouragement. The truth is, we're in trouble, Nathan said, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. The ranch has been losing money for a while now. We owe the bank, and if we can't pay them, they'll take the land. I've been trying to figure out how to fix it, but... He stopped, swallowed hard. But I haven't been able to do it alone. Why didn't you tell us? James demanded, anger mixing with fear. We're not babies. We could have helped. You are helping. You work harder than any boys your age should have to. I didn't want to burden you with more. But we're a family, Thomas said, his voice small. Families share burdens. That's what Ma used to say. Nathan's composure cracked. He pressed a hand to his eyes, his shoulders shaking. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have done better, should have been stronger. Eleanor watched James and Thomas exchange glances, some silent communication passing between them. Then, as one, they moved to their father's side. James put a hand on Nathan's shoulder, and Thomas wrapped his arms around his father's waist. You did your best, Pa, James said fiercely. Nobody could have done more. And Miss Eleanor's here now, Thomas added. She said we'd fight together. That means all of us, right? Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. These boys, who'd already lost so much, were choosing to stand and fight for what remained. It was heartbreaking and inspiring all at once. Right, she managed. All of us. But that means we all have to be honest with each other. No more secrets, no more protecting each other from hard truths. Can we agree to that? Foreheads nodded, and something in the room shifted. They weren't just 4 people sharing a house anymore. They were becoming something more, a unit, a team, a family learning to trust each other. So what do we do? James asked, straightening and wiping his eyes roughly. How do we save the ranch? Eleanor pulled her notes forward. We start by taking inventory of everything we have. Then we look for opportunities we might have missed. And we work, all of us, harder and smarter than we've ever worked before. I can take on more chores, James offered immediately. I can handle the cattle check on my own, and help with mending fence. I can collect more eggs, Thomas said. And I can learn to bake, help Miss Eleanor with whatever she needs. Nathan looked at his sons with naked pride and pain. You boys shouldn't have to— Pa, stop, James interrupted. You told us the truth. Now let us help. That's what families do. For the rest of the morning, they worked together, cataloging every asset the ranch possessed. Eleanor learned that Nathan had skill with woodwork, that James could shoot well enough to hunt game, that Thomas had a surprising talent for numbers. Each piece of information went into her notes, building a picture of their resources. At noon, Eleanor made sandwiches from the bread she'd brought from town and the last of the bacon. They ate at the table, talking through possibilities, discarding ideas that wouldn't work and noting ones that might. It wasn't comfortable. The weight of their situation was too heavy for that, but it was honest, and there was strange comfort in that honesty. What about the social in town next week? Thomas said suddenly. Pa, you always said Ma's quilts were the finest around. What if Miss Eleanor could make things to sell there? I'm not much of a quilter, Eleanor admitted, but I can bake, and I can sew well enough for practical items. What kind of social is it? Harvest Festival, Nathan explained. Town puts it on every year before winter sets in. There's usually a few vendors selling goods, games for the children, that sort of thing. Could we sell baked goods there? And perhaps some preserves if we can gather enough berries? Eleanor was already calculating in her head. If we price things right, we might clear $20 or $30. That's something, James said. It's not 500, but it's something. Everything adds up, Eleanor agreed. 20 here, 30 there. We're not going to solve this with one grand gesture. We'll solve it with 100 small ones. They spent the afternoon in focused activity. Eleanor and Thomas took baskets and went berry picking along the stream, finding wild plums and choke cherries that could be made into preserves. James and Nathan worked on fence repair, but with a new urgency. Every hour of work was an hour invested in keeping the ranch viable. As Eleanor and Thomas picked berries, the boy chattered about his mother, tentatively at first, as if testing whether Eleanor would allow it. When she asked gentle questions, encouraging him to share memories, he opened up like a flower to sunlight. Ma used to make the best plum cake, he said, carefully dropping fruit into his basket. She'd let me help stir, and I always made a mess. But she never got mad. She'd just laugh and say the best cooks were messy ones. She sounds wonderful, Eleanor said honestly. I wish I could have known her. Do you think— Thomas stopped, struggling with the question. Do you think she'd be mad that Pa brought you here? Some of the ladies in town say it's wrong, that he's replacing her. Eleanor set down her basket and turned to face the boy fully. Thomas, look at me. Your father isn't replacing your mother. Nobody could do that, and nobody should try. Your mother was important and special, and she'll always be part of your family. Always. Do you understand? Thomas nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. But families can grow, Eleanor continued gently. They can make room for new people without forgetting the ones they've lost. That's not betrayal. That's survival. That's choosing to keep living and loving even when it's hard. So you're not trying to be our Ma? No, sweetheart. I'm just trying to be Eleanor. Someone who cares about you and your brother and your father. Someone who wants to help. Is that all right? Thomas considered this carefully, then nodded. Yeah, that's all right. They picked in companionable silence for a while longer, and Eleanor felt the weight of the boy's trust settle over her like a mantle. These children had been hurt by loss, made wary by disappointment. Earning their trust was precious, and she'd guard it carefully. When they returned to the house with full baskets, they found Nathan and James in the yard, washing up after their work. Both were dusty and tired, but there was something different in their bearing, purpose maybe, or simply the relief of no longer carrying secrets. Good haul, Nathan observed, eyeing the berries. Haven't seen preserves made in this kitchen in 2 years. Then it's time we change that, Eleanor said. James, can you help me carry these inside? Thomas, if you'll fetch more jars from the cellar, your father said there were empties down there. The evening took on a rhythm as they worked together. Eleanor showed Thomas how to prepare the fruit while James helped sterilize jars. Nathan sat at the table going through the books again with fresh eyes, occasionally calling out questions or observations. The kitchen filled with the smell of cooking fruit and sugar, and for the first time since Eleanor had arrived, the house felt truly alive. My mother used to do this with her sisters, Eleanor said, stirring the bubbling preserves. They'd spend whole days putting up food for winter, talking and laughing. I always loved those days, the house so warm and full of good smells, everyone working together toward something. Did you have a big family? Thomas asked. No, just me and my parents. But my mother had 4 sisters, and when we all gathered, it felt big, noisy and chaotic and wonderful. Eleanor smiled at the memory. I always wished for siblings, brothers especially. I imagined they'd be brave and loyal, that they'd teach me about things like fishing and climbing trees. We could teach you to fish, Thomas offered. Couldn't we, James? James looked up from the jars he was arranging. The stream's got good trout this time of year. Could go tomorrow afternoon if Pa doesn't need us for something else. I'd like that, Eleanor said, meaning it, though I should warn you I'm likely to be terrible at it. That's all right, Thomas assured her. James is terrible at baking, and you're teaching him anyway. I'm not terrible, James protested. I just haven't practiced much. The gentle teasing continued as they worked, and Eleanor marveled at how quickly they'd fallen into this pattern. Yesterday, she'd been a stranger. Today, she was someone the boys teased, someone they invited fishing, someone they trusted with their mother's memory. When the preserves were finally sealed in jars and cooling on the counter, Eleanor straightened and pressed a hand to her aching back. It was nearly dark, and they'd worked straight through without stopping. 18 jars, Nathan said, coming to stand beside her. At $1 per jar at the festival, that's $18 toward the debt. Plus whatever we make from baked goods, Eleanor added. It's a start. It's more than that. Nathan's voice was quiet. It's the first time in 2 years I've felt like we might actually have a chance. Eleanor looked at him in the lamplight, this man who'd been carrying so much for so long. We do have a chance. Not a guarantee, but a chance. And sometimes that's enough. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the jars cool, and Eleanor felt the day's exhaustion settle into her bones. But it was good exhaustion, the kind that came from honest work and shared purpose. I'll make supper, Nathan said finally. You've done enough for today. We'll make it together, Eleanor corrected. That's how this works now, remember? Together. Nathan's smile was small but genuine. Together. I'm still getting used to that. They prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread with the last of the fresh eggs scrambled for extra sustenance. The boys appeared when called, scrubbed clean and in fresh shirts, and they all sat down to eat. Tomorrow we start on festival preparations in earnest, Eleanor said. I'll need to make a list of what goods sell best. Nathan, what do people in town usually buy? Practical things mostly, preserves, as you're doing. Bread keeps well. Peace, if you can keep them from getting crushed on the journey. I can make traveling pies, hand pies, small ones that are easy to carry and eat. If we price them right, we might sell quite a few. Eleanor was already planning in her head. We'll need to inventory our supplies. I can't spend money we don't have on ingredients. There's flour enough, and I can spare some sugar, Nathan said. Berries we've got plenty of now. Butter might be tight. I can churn more, Thomas offered. There's cream from yesterday still waiting. The conversation flowed easily, planning and problem-solving mixing with the simple business of eating together. Eleanor found herself watching the boys, noting how they'd relaxed over the course of the day. The fear in their eyes had been replaced with something that looked almost like hope. After supper, James retrieved Treasure Island without prompting, and they gathered on the porch again in the evening cool. Eleanor read 2 chapters this time, caught up in the story herself, and noticed Nathan standing in the doorway, listening. When she finished, both boys groaned at stopping. Just one more chapter, Thomas pleaded. Tomorrow, Eleanor promised. We'll have more tomorrow. As the boys headed inside to bed, Nathan lingered on the porch with Eleanor. The night was clear, stars brilliant overhead, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. Thank you, Nathan said quietly, for today, for not running when you saw how bad things really are. I told you, I'm done running. Eleanor looked up at the stars. Besides, I meant what I said. We have a chance, and I'd rather fight for a chance than surrender to certainty. The boys trust you already. I can see it. They're good boys. They just needed someone to show up and stay. She glanced at him. We all did, I think. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I'm not good at this. At letting people help. At trusting. Sarah used to say I carried the weight of the world on my shoulders because I was too stubborn to share it. She was right. I know. He smiled slightly. She usually was. But I'm trying, Eleanor. I'm trying to do what you asked. To let you be a partner in this. It just doesn't come natural. Nothing worthwhile ever does, Eleanor said. But we'll figure it out. One day at a time, remember? One day at a time, Nathan echoed. They stood together in the darkness, not quite touching, but somehow connected, two people learning to carry a burden that had been crushing one of them alone. Above, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, and the ranch settled into night around them. Inside, Eleanor could hear the boys moving in the loft, their voices a low murmur as they talked before sleep. It was such a simple sound, children feeling safe enough to whisper and laugh in the darkness. But after everything she'd learned today, she understood how precious that sound was, how hard-won. She thought of the debt waiting, the bank payment looming, all the ways this fragile piece could shatter. But she also thought of 18 jars of preserves cooling in the kitchen, of plans taking shape, of a family learning to fight together instead of suffer alone. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was something to build on. And sometimes, Eleanor thought as she finally headed inside to sleep, something was exactly enough to start with. The week before the Harvest Festival passed in a blur of activity that left little time for worry. Eleanor rose before dawn each morning to begin baking, her hands working dough while the household still slept. By the time Nathan and the boys emerged for breakfast, the kitchen would be warm with bread cooling on racks, and Eleanor would already be starting the next batch. Thomas proved invaluable, his small hands quick at crimping the edges of hand pies, and his careful attention perfect for watching the oven temperature. James took over more of the outdoor work, giving Nathan time to make repairs to the wagon they'd use for the festival and to ride into town to spread word about their booth. On the third morning, Eleanor was elbow-deep in pie dough when she heard horses approaching. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window, spotting two riders coming up the drive. Nathan emerged from the barn, his posture immediately wary. "Stay inside," he called to the boys who'd been carrying water from the stream. Something in his tone made Eleanor's stomach clench. She watched as the riders dismounted, two men in town clothes, one carrying a leather satchel. The taller one spoke to Nathan, gesturing toward the house and land. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see Nathan's jaw tighten, his hands clenching at his sides. The conversation lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. Finally, the men mounted and rode away, and Nathan stood in the yard, staring after them, his shoulders rigid. Eleanor moved to the door. "Nathan?" He didn't turn. "Banks and appraisers wanted to assess the value of the property." The words hit like a physical blow. "Already? But the payment isn't due for 2 more months." "They're preparing, in case we can't pay." Nathan's voice was hollow. They walked the land, looked at the stock, counted the buildings. One of them even asked if the furniture was part of the original deed or if we'd brought it ourselves. Eleanor descended the porch steps and moved to his side. Behind them, she could feel the boys watching from the window. "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That we're working on it, that we have a plan." He finally looked at her, and the despair in his eyes made her chest ache. "They smiled like I'd told them a joke, said they'd heard that one before. They're trying to intimidate you." "It's working." Nathan rubbed a hand over his face. "They valued everything, Eleanor. The land, the buildings, even counted the cattle from the ridge. Do you know what they said it's worth? $7,000, and we owe $1,500 against it. They'll take everything and sell it for 5 times what we owe them, and there's not a damn thing I can do about it." Eleanor grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "Yes, there is. We can keep fighting. We can go to that festival and sell every single item we've made. We can find that partner ranch you need for the cattle drive. We can go to the bank with our plan like we discussed. And if it's not enough, then we try something else, and something else after that. Nathan, listen to me." She tightened her grip on his arm. "Those men want you to give up. They want you to roll over and make their job easy. Don't give them the satisfaction. He stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with fear and anger and exhaustion. Finally, something hardened in his expression. "You're right. I'll be damned if I make this easy for them." "That's better." Eleanor released his arm. "Now come inside. We have pies to finish and a festival to prepare for. And tonight, we're going to sit down and write out exactly what we'll say to the bank. We're going to present ourselves as a business worth investing in, not desperate people begging for mercy." Nathan followed her inside, where the boys stood frozen by the window. James's face was pale, and Thomas looked close to tears. "It's all right," Nathan said, moving to them. "We're not giving up. You hear me? Those men can count and assess all they want. This ranch is ours, and we're keeping it." "But they can just take it?" James asked, his voice cracking. "Even though we live here? Even though it's our home?" "Not if we pay what we owe." Nathan knelt to their level. "And we're going to do everything we can to make that happen. But I need you boys to be brave. Can you do that?" Both boys nodded, though their eyes remained frightened. Eleanor's heart broke for them. Children who'd already lost so much, now facing the possibility of losing what little remained. "Come help me with the pies," she said gently. "We need 30 more by tomorrow evening. That's good money if we can manage it." They returned to work with renewed urgency, the bank appraiser's visit hanging over them like a storm cloud. But Eleanor refused to let fear paralyze them. She kept up a steady stream of conversation as they worked, asking the boys about their favorite foods, about games they played, about anything to keep their minds occupied. By evening, they had 42 hand pies cooling on every available surface, along with 6 loaves of bread and all 18 jars of preserves. Eleanor's back ached and her hands were raw from the work, but when she looked at their inventory, she felt a fierce satisfaction. At 25 cents per pie, that's $10.50, she calculated aloud. The bread at 50 cents each is $3, and the preserves at $1 make 18. That's $31.50 if we sell everything. "It's not enough," James said quietly. "Not even close to 500. "No, but it's a start. And it's $31 we didn't have before." Eleanor met his eyes. "Every bit counts, James. We're not going to fix this with one grand gesture. We're going to fix it with 100 small ones." Nathan had been quiet through supper, his mind clearly elsewhere. But when the boys went to bed and Eleanor began cleaning the kitchen, he finally spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said, about finding a partner ranch." He leaned against the counter. "There's a man, Jacob Morrison, who runs a spread about 15 miles west. He's got a similar setup to ours, struggling the same way. His wife died last year, and he's raising 3 daughters alone. You think he might be willing to partner on the cattle drive? I think he's desperate enough to consider it. If we combine our herds, we've got enough cattle to make the trip worthwhile, even with the fort's reduced order. And if we split the cost of drovers, we both come out ahead. Then you should ride over there tomorrow. Talk to him." Nathan hesitated. "I hate leaving you alone with all this work." "I won't be alone. I have James and Thomas. And this is important, Nathan. If we can secure that contract, we're halfway to making the payment." Eleanor dried her hands on a towel. "Besides, I need you to stop by the bank while you're in town. Ask for a meeting." "They're not going to extend the loan, Eleanor." "Maybe not, but we need to try. And we need to present ourselves as people with a plan, not people waiting for a miracle." She moved to stand in front of him. "Trust me on this. I've dealt with administrators and board members who held my livelihood in their hands. I know how to present a case, but I need you to get us the meeting." Nathan studied her face, and Eleanor held his gaze steadily. Finally, he nodded. "All right. I'll ride out at first light. But Eleanor, if this doesn't work, then we'll try something else. Stop preparing for failure, Nathan. Start fighting for success." He reached out and squeezed her hand briefly. "I don't know what I did to deserve you showing up when you did, but I'm grateful." The simple statement delivered without artifice made Eleanor's throat tight. "We're going to save this ranch," she said firmly. "All of us together. Now go get some rest. You have a long ride tomorrow." Nathan departed before dawn, leaving Eleanor with detailed instructions for the boys' chores and promises to return by evening. Eleanor threw herself into festival preparations, grateful for the work that kept her hands busy and her mind from spinning worst-case scenarios. Around mid-morning, as she was packaging pies in careful layers of cloth, she heard a wagon approaching. Through the window, she spotted a woman driving, two young girls beside her. Eleanor wiped her hands and went to greet them, curious about visitors. The woman who climbed down was perhaps 40, with tired eyes and capable hands. She wore a faded calico dress and a determined expression. "You must be Eleanor Whitfield. I'm Margaret Hadley. My husband owns the Mercantile in Sweetwater." "Mrs. Hadley," Eleanor offered her hand. "What brings you all the way out here?" "Word in town is you're setting up at the festival. Baked goods and preserves." Margaret's eyes swept over the ranch with the practiced assessment of someone who knew what to look for. "Also heard you're Nathan Hale's mail-order bride." Eleanor felt heat creep up her neck. "I am." "Must have been quite a shock coming out here to find a widower with two boys and a failing ranch." Margaret's tone wasn't unkind, just matter-of-fact. "Most women would have turned tail and run." "I'm not most women." "No, I can see that." Margaret gestured to her girls, who were eyeing Thomas and James with shy curiosity. "These are my daughters, Sarah and Emma. I came with a proposition, Mrs. Whitfield, or may I call you Eleanor?" "Eleanor is fine. Would you like to come inside? I can put coffee on." They settled at the kitchen table while the children gravitated toward each other in that mysterious way young people had. Margaret accepted coffee gratefully and got straight to the point. "My husband and I have been watching the Hale Ranch struggle. We liked Sarah, Nathan's wife, quite a lot, and we've worried about those boys." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "When we heard Nathan had sent for a bride, half the town took bets on how long you'd last. But you're still here, and from what I saw riding in, you're working. So here's my proposition. I'll buy your preserves wholesale. All 18 jars at 75 cents each. That's $13.50 in your pocket right now. And I'll sell them in the Mercantile for $1.25. We both profit." Eleanor's mind raced. $13.50 immediately versus $18 if she sold them all at the festival. But at the festival, there was no guarantee she'd sell out. "What about the pies and bread?" "Those you should sell at the festival. Fresh baked goods do well there and you'll get full price. But preserves sit on a shelf. Let me take the risk of selling them. You focus on what will make you the most money this weekend." It was a good offer, practical and fair. Eleanor extended her hand. "Deal. But I want to continue supplying you if these sell well. Can we work out an ongoing arrangement?" Margaret's smile was genuine. "I was hoping you'd say that. Sarah used to supply me with eggs and butter. If you're willing to take that on, I'll give you fair price for both." They spent the next hour working out details while the children played in the yard. By the time Margaret loaded the preserves into her wagon and departed, Eleanor had secured a steady income stream of $15 monthly, not nearly enough to save the ranch, but enough to ease the constant pressure of daily expenses. James appeared at her elbow as the wagon disappeared down the road. "That was smart," he said quietly. "Taking the sure money instead of gambling on the festival." "Sometimes the sure thing is worth more than the gamble." Eleanor ruffled his hair. "Come on, we still have work to do." They spent the afternoon organizing their remaining festival goods and practicing their sales pitch. Eleanor coached both boys on how to greet customers, how to make change, how to present their wares attractively. Thomas proved to have a natural charm with people, while James excelled at the mathematical precision of handling money. Nathan returned just as the sun was setting, his horse exhausted and his own face showing the strain of a full day in the saddle. But when he dismounted, there was something different in his bearing. "Morrison agreed," he said without preamble. "He's in worse shape than we are. He'll combine herds and split costs. We leave for the fort in 2 weeks." Eleanor felt relief surge through her. "That's wonderful. What about the bank?" Nathan's expression darkened. "I spoke to Charles Winters. He's the bank manager. He agreed to meet with us Monday morning at 10. But Eleanor, he wasn't encouraging. Said he's seen too many ranchers make promises they can't keep. He's expecting us to fail." "Then we'll surprise him." Eleanor moved to help him with his horse. "I have news too. Margaret Hadley bought all our preserves wholesale, and I've secured a monthly contract for eggs and butter. It's not much, but it's steady income." Nathan stopped short. "Margaret bought the preserves? All of them?" $13.50. In cash. It's in the tin on the mantel. Eleanor led the horse toward the barn. We're making progress, Nathan. Slow progress, but progress nonetheless. They settled the horse and walked back to the house together. Inside, the boys had supper waiting, a simple stew they'd managed on their own, clearly proud of their accomplishment. Nathan praised them warmly, and Eleanor noted how his demeanor had shifted. The defeat from this morning had been replaced with something like determination. Over supper, Nathan shared details of his conversation with Morrison. The man was barely hanging on, drowning in debt from medical bills after his wife's prolonged illness, struggling to work the ranch while caring for 3 girls under 12. But he jumped at the chance to partner, seeing it as his own lifeline. We'll drive the combined herd to the fort together, Nathan explained. Split the profits 50-50 after we pay the drovers. If the contract holds, we should each clear enough to make our bank payments with something left over. And if the fort cancels? James asked quietly. Then we find another buyer. There's a mining camp up north that always needs beef. It won't pay as well, but it's something. Nathan met his son's eyes. We're not going to quit, James, no matter what obstacles come up. After supper, Eleanor read from Treasure Island while Nathan sat listening, and when the boys finally went to bed, she and Nathan remained at the table, working on the presentation for the bank. We need to show them we understand business, Eleanor said, writing careful notes. Not just that we hope things will work out. Concrete plans, realistic projections, evidence of income diversification. I'm a rancher, not a businessman. You're both. Ranching is a business. You've just been too close to it to see that. Eleanor tapped her pencil against the paper. We'll present the cattle contract as primary income, then show the supplementary income from eggs, butter, and my baked goods. We'll demonstrate that we're not dependent on a single source of revenue. They worked late into the night, drafting and revising their proposal until Eleanor's eyes burned with exhaustion. But when they finally had something they were both satisfied with, she felt cautiously optimistic. This might actually work, Nathan said, reading over the final draft. If Winters has any business sense at all, he'll see we're a better investment than foreclosure. Let's hope his business sense outweighs his prejudice against struggling ranchers. Eleanor rubbed her tired eyes. Now get some sleep. The festival is tomorrow, and we need to be sharp. The morning of the harvest festival dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for the event. Eleanor was up before sunrise, loading the wagon with their carefully packed goods while Nathan hitched the horses. The boys were nearly vibrating with excitement. They'd been to the festival before, but never as vendors, never as part of the solution to their family's troubles. The ride into Sweetwater took 2 hours, giving them plenty of time to set up before the crowds arrived. The festival grounds were situated in the town square, with vendors arranged around the perimeter and games and activities in the center. Eleanor was surprised by the number of people already there, ranchers and townsfolk from miles around, all eager for the social event that marked the end of harvest season. Margaret Hadley spotted them immediately and directed them to a prime spot near the mercantile. You'll get good foot traffic here, she said, helping Eleanor arrange their wares on the borrowed table Nathan had brought. And Eleanor, good luck today. The first customers arrived before they'd finished setting up, drawn by the smell of fresh bread. By mid-morning, they'd sold half their inventory, and Eleanor had to send James back to the wagon for the reserve pies she'd hidden underneath. Thomas proved to be a natural salesman, chatting easily with customers and somehow making each person feel special. James handled the money with meticulous care, making change and tracking sales in a small notebook. Nathan stood back, clearly uncomfortable with the social aspects but proud of his son's confidence. Around noon, a familiar face appeared in the crowd. Charles Winters, the bank manager, stopped at their booth with his wife. He was a portly man with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested he was perpetually calculating interest rates. "Mr. Hale," he said coolly, "I see you're branching out into retail." "Diversifying our income streams, Mr. Winters." Nathan's voice was carefully neutral. "I believe we have a meeting scheduled for Monday morning?" "Indeed we do." Winters' gaze swept over their nearly empty table. "Selling out, are you?" "Just about." Eleanor stepped forward, offering her hand. "I'm Eleanor Whitfield. We're looking forward to presenting our business plan to you." Winters took her hand briefly, his expression skeptical. "A business plan. How ambitious." Mrs. Winters was just saying she wanted to try your hand pies. We'll take two. It was clearly a test, a way to see if they'd beg for his approval or treat him like any other customer. Eleanor simply wrapped 2 pies in cloth and accepted his payment with a pleasant smile, refusing to show desperation. After he'd moved on, Nathan released a breath he'd been holding. That could have gone worse. Or better. Eleanor watched Winters disappear into the crowd. But at least he knows we're serious, that we're not just sitting around waiting for charity. By mid-afternoon, they'd sold everything except 3 loaves of bread, which Eleanor donated to the church's community supper. The money box was heavy with coins and bills, and when they finally counted it during a lull, the total made Eleanor's breath catch. $34.75, James announced, carefully recording the final tally. Plus the $13.50 from Mrs. Hadley's advance. That's $48.25 total. It was more than Eleanor had dared hope for. Combined with her savings and careful budgeting, they were beginning to assemble a meaningful sum. Not enough for the full payment, but enough to show the bank they were serious. As they packed up in the late afternoon, several people stopped to compliment their goods and ask if they'd be selling regularly. Eleanor took names and promised to work out a delivery schedule, seeing opportunity in every conversation. On the ride home, with the boys dozing in the wagon bed and the sun painting the mountains gold, Nathan finally let his guard down. "I can't believe we made nearly $50 in one day," he said quietly. "That's more than I clear some months from the ranch. It's proof that we don't have to rely solely on cattle." Eleanor leaned back against the seat, exhausted but satisfied. "There are multiple ways to make this place profitable. We just have to be willing to try." "You've changed things here," Nathan said, his voice rough. "In just a week. The boys are different, lighter, somehow. The house feels different. Even I feel different." Eleanor glanced at him, noting the way the evening light caught in his eyes. "You were all just waiting for someone to believe in you, to show up and not give up. You've done more than show up." Nathan met her eyes briefly before returning his attention to the road. "You've given us hope, and I don't know how to thank you for that." "You don't need to thank me. Just keep fighting alongside me. That's all I need." They rode in comfortable silence as the ranch came into view, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. This place, these people, they were becoming hers in a way Boston never had. Not because she owned them or they needed her, but because she'd chosen them. Because she'd looked at their struggles and decided they were worth fighting for. The bank meeting loomed ahead, along with 1,000 other challenges. But tonight, rolling into the ranch yard with a money box full of hope and 2 sleeping boys in the back, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could actually pull this off. Nathan caught her eye as he set the brake, and his small smile told her he was thinking the same thing. They climbed down and began unloading the wagon together, their movements synchronized from a week of working side by side, and Eleanor realized that somewhere in the chaos and struggle, they'd become exactly what she'd told the bank they were. They'd become a team. Sunday passed in tense preparation. Eleanor pressed Nathan's best shirt and mended a tear in the collar that he'd been ignoring for months. She altered one of her own dresses to look more businesslike, adding a fresh collar and cuffs that gave it a professional air. The boys sensed the importance of the coming meeting and were unusually quiet, helping with chores without being asked and staying out of the way while their father and Eleanor rehearsed their presentation. That evening after supper, as twilight painted the prairie in shades of purple and gold, Nathan found Eleanor on the porch staring toward the mountains. She'd been there for nearly an hour, her hands folded in her lap, her expression distant. "Having second thoughts?" he asked quietly, settling into the chair beside her. "About the meeting?" "No." Eleanor didn't look at him. "About everything else?" "Maybe." Nathan waited, giving her space to continue. He'd learned over the past week that Eleanor thought best when she could work through things aloud, but she needed time to gather her words. "I keep thinking about what happens if this doesn't work," she said finally. "If the bank says no and the cattle contract falls through and we lose everything despite all our efforts, where does that leave us? Where does that leave the boys?" "It leaves us starting over somewhere else," Nathan said. "Together, if you're still willing." Eleanor turned to face him, surprise flickering in her eyes. "You'd want me to stay, even if we lost the ranch?" "The ranch is just land, Eleanor, just buildings and fences and dirt. It's not what makes a family. Nathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. These past 10 days, watching you with the boys, working beside you, seeing you fight for something that isn't even yours yet. I've realized something. I brought you here thinking I needed help saving this place. But what I really needed was someone to remind me what I was fighting for in the first place. The boys, Eleanor said softly. The boys, a future. A reason to get up in the morning that goes beyond just surviving another day. He met her eyes. You've given that back to me. So yes, if we lose the ranch, I'd want you to stay, because you're part of this family now, whether the bank agrees or not. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. In Boston, she'd been alone in rooms full of people, always temporary, always preparing for the next move. But here, in this failing ranch in the middle of nowhere, she'd found something she'd stopped believing existed. I'm not going anywhere, she said firmly. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together. Nathan reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged, and Eleanor felt the weight of what they were building settle over her like a blessing. Not a marriage of convenience or desperation, but something real and earned, a partnership forged in honest work and shared struggle. Inside, they could hear the boys getting ready for bed, their voices a low murmur punctuated by occasional laughter, normal sounds of childhood that had been absent for too long. They sound happy, Nathan observed. They are happy. Or at least they're learning how to be again. Eleanor squeezed his hand. That's worth fighting for, Nathan, whatever it costs. Even if it costs everything? Especially then. Because sometimes the only way to show people they matter is to fight for them even when the odds are impossible. They stayed on the porch until the air grew cold enough to drive them inside, and when Nathan finally released her hand and said goodnight, Eleanor felt the loss of his touch like a physical ache. Something was shifting between them, something deeper than partnership, more complex than simple affection. But there was no time to examine it now, not with tomorrow's meeting looming. Eleanor slept fitfully, her dreams filled with ledgers and stern-faced bankers and the image of the boys' faces when they learned they'd lost their home. She woke before dawn, unrested but determined, and threw herself into preparing breakfast with almost desperate energy. The ride into town was quiet, tension thick in the wagon. Eleanor had left the boys with detailed instructions for their chores and a promise that they'd return before dark. Both had hugged her fiercely before they'd left, as if afraid she might not come back. Sweetwater looked different on a Monday morning, purposeful and busy rather than festive. Nathan drove straight to the bank, an imposing brick building that dominated the town square. He set the brake and helped Eleanor down, and together they stood staring at the carved wooden doors as if they were the gates to judgment itself. Remember, Eleanor said quietly, we're not begging. We're presenting a viable business proposition. We have value to offer. We have desperation to hide, Nathan countered. Desperation and determination look the same from the outside. It's all in how you present it. Eleanor smoothed her skirts and lifted her chin. Ready? As I'll ever be. The bank's interior was all dark wood and polished brass, designed to intimidate. A young clerk looked up from his desk as they entered, his expression shifting from professional welcome to poorly concealed disdain when he recognized Nathan. Mr. Hale. Mrs. Whitfield. He managed to make both names sound like an accusation. Mr. Winters is expecting you. Through there. Charles Winters' office was smaller than Eleanor had expected, but meticulously organized. The bank manager sat behind a massive desk that dwarfed him, clearly chosen to project authority his physical stature didn't naturally command. He gestured to the chairs across from him without rising. Mr. Hale. And this must be the infamous mail-order bride who's going to save your ranch with pies and preserves. His tone made it clear what he thought of their chances. Eleanor felt Nathan tense beside her, but kept her own voice pleasant. Eleanor Whitfield, Mr. Winters. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. We appreciate your time. Winters pulled out a folder and opened it with deliberate slowness. I've reviewed your account, Hale. You're carrying a balance of $1,500 at 8% interest, with a payment of $500 due November 15th. You've made your payments on time so far, but just barely. And my appraisers tell me you're running thin. Equipment needs replacing, fences are failing, You're understaffed for the size of your operation. Which is why we're here, Nathan said. We have a plan to not just make the payment, but to turn the ranch around completely. Everyone has a plan. Winters leaned back in his chair. Usually right before they lose everything. What makes yours different? Eleanor opened the folio she'd brought and laid out their carefully prepared documents. What makes ours different is diversification and partnership. We're not relying on a single income stream or gambling everything on one contract. We're building multiple revenue sources that support each other. She walked Winters through their proposal methodically, pointing to figures and projections as she spoke. The cattle contract with the fort, estimated to bring in $800 split with Morrison. The monthly income from eggs and butter sold to Hadley's Mercantile, guaranteed at $15. Her own baking enterprise, which had generated $50 in its first week and had standing orders from several town families. Nathan's plan to take on seasonal labor for neighboring ranches during slow periods, leveraging his experience for additional income. You're proposing to turn a cattle ranch into a general store and boarding house, Winters said dryly. We're proposing to use every asset we have to generate revenue, Eleanor corrected. The cattle remain our primary focus, but by supplementing with these additional streams, we create stability. If one source fails, we have others to fall back on. And what happens when your baking enterprise saturates the local market? Or when Hadley finds a cheaper supplier? Or when the fort decides to source their beef from Colorado after all? Winters tapped the papers. You're building on quicksand, Miss Whitfield. Multiple weak foundations don't make one strong one. With respect, Mr. Winters, a single strong foundation can still crack, Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. But a structure supported by multiple points is harder to topple. You're correct that any one of these income sources could fail, but the likelihood of all of them failing simultaneously is much lower than the likelihood of a single cattle contract falling through. Winters studied her with sharp eyes, and Eleanor held his gaze without flinching. Beside her, Nathan sat rigid, his hands clenched on the arms of his chair. You're educated, Winters observed. Not what I expected from a mail-order bride desperate enough to come to Wyoming. I was a teacher in Boston for 8 years, Eleanor said evenly. I came here by choice, not desperation, and I chose to invest my own savings in this enterprise because I believe it's viable. How much? $200, which Nathan has added to the ranch's operating capital. Winters' eyebrows rose slightly. So you have skin in the game. That's something, at least. He pulled their projections closer and studied them in silence for several long minutes. Eleanor could hear the clock on the wall ticking, could feel Nathan's tension radiating beside her, could sense their entire future balanced on whatever this man decided. Finally, Winters set down the papers and steepled his fingers. Here's my problem, Hale. You're asking me to have faith in a turnaround story I've heard a dozen times. Maybe your projections are accurate. Maybe you'll make every one of these income streams work. But probably you'll run into the same problems every struggling rancher runs into. Weather, market fluctuations, simple bad luck. And then I'm left holding worthless land I have to manage or sell at a loss. So you're saying no, Nathan said flatly. I'm saying I need more than projections and promises. Winters leaned forward. You want me to extend your loan or reduce your payment? Give me something concrete. Show me you're not just scrambling to delay the inevitable. Eleanor thought rapidly, running through everything they had, everything they could offer. What if we made a substantial payment now? Not the full $500, but enough to show good faith and reduce the principal. How substantial? Eleanor glanced at Nathan, saw his minute nod. $250. Half the payment, delivered today. It was everything they'd made from the festival, Margaret's advance, and a significant portion of Eleanor's savings. It would leave them almost nothing for operating expenses, but it would cut their debt significantly and prove they were serious. Winters calculated silently. $250 against the principal would reduce your total debt to $1,250. The November payment would drop to approximately $400. He tapped his desk thoughtfully. That's not nothing. And we'd commit to making that payment in full on November 15th, Eleanor added. Not late, not partial, full payment. Can you guarantee that? The cattle contract alone will cover it, Nathan said, finding his voice. And if something happens to that contract, we have enough supplementary income to make it work. We're not gambling, Mr. Winters. We're building systematically. Winters studied them both for another long moment. Eleanor could see him weighing risks and potential rewards, calculating whether they were worth the gamble. Finally, he pulled out a fresh piece of paper and began writing. I'll accept the $250 today and reduce your November payment to $400 even. But I'm adding a condition. He looked up sharply. I want monthly reports on your progress, detailed accounting of income and expenses. If I see you slipping, if those supplementary income streams dry up, I'm calling the loan. No extensions, no negotiations. You'll have 30 days to pay in full or I foreclose immediately. It was harsh, but it was a chance. Eleanor looked at Nathan, saw the same desperate hope in his eyes that she felt in her chest. Agreed, Nathan said hoarsely. Thank you, Mr. Winters. Don't thank me yet. You've still got to make it work. Winters pulled out a receipt book. Get me that $250 and I'll mark your account adjusted. And Hale, don't make me regret this. They left the bank 20 minutes later, significantly poorer but with a revised loan agreement that felt like a lifeline. Nathan was quiet as they climbed into the wagon, his face unreadable. Eleanor waited until they were out of town before speaking. We did it, she said quietly. We bought ourselves time. We bought ourselves a noose with a longer rope, Nathan corrected. If anything goes wrong now, anything at all, we don't just lose the ranch. We lose it knowing we had a chance and failed anyway. Then we don't fail. Eleanor twisted to face him. Nathan, look at me. We don't fail. We work harder than we've ever worked. We make every one of those income streams succeed, and we save this ranch. You make it sound simple. It's not simple. It's nearly impossible. But we can do it. She grabbed his arm. We can do this. Nathan pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to her, his eyes searching her face. Why do you believe that? What makes you so sure? Because I've seen what we can accomplish in 10 days. We went from strangers to a team. We generated $50 from nothing. We secured contracts and partnerships. We convinced a banker to give us a chance when he'd already written us off. Eleanor's voice grew fierce. We're not the same people who sat at that table talking about giving up. We're fighters now, all of us. And fighters don't quit just because the odds are bad. Nathan stared at her for a long moment, then did something that shocked them both. He pulled her into a fierce embrace, his face pressed against her hair, his arms tight around her shoulders. Eleanor froze for a heartbeat, then wrapped her arms around him and held on just as tightly. Thank you, he whispered roughly, for showing up, for staying, for fighting when I'd forgotten how. They stayed that way for several moments, holding each other in the middle of the empty road, and Eleanor felt something fundamental shift between them. This wasn't just partnership anymore. This was something deeper, something that went beyond saving a ranch or making payments. This was two people learning to trust each other with everything, their fears, their hopes, their futures. When they finally separated, both were carefully not looking at each other, the moment too raw to examine directly. Nathan clicked to the horses and they started moving again, but Eleanor could feel the change hanging in the air between them, like electricity before a storm. The boys met them in the yard before they'd even set the brake, their faces anxious and hopeful all at once. Well, James demanded, what did he say? He said yes, Nathan answered, climbing down. With conditions, but yes. We made a payment today that bought us some breathing room. Thomas whooped and grabbed his brother's arm, and even James allowed himself a smile. But Eleanor could see the calculation in the older boy's eyes, the understanding that this wasn't salvation, just a postponement of judgment. How much breathing room? James asked quietly. Nathan hesitated, then decided on honesty. Until November 15th, and we owe $400 instead of $500. But if we miss that payment, the bank can call the whole loan immediately. So we have 2 months, James said. 2 months, Nathan confirmed, which means the cattle drive has to go perfectly. Morrison and I leave in a week, which gives us time to gather the herd and make final preparations. And while you're gone, we keep everything else running, Eleanor added. The boys and I will handle the ranch, maintain the egg and butter deliveries, and I'll continue baking. We're all in this together. That evening, they sat down together and created a detailed schedule for the 2 weeks Nathan would be gone. Eleanor would take over most of his daily responsibilities, with James handling the heavier work and Thomas managing the chickens and garden. They'd work in shifts to ensure someone was always available if problems arose. "I don't like leaving you alone," Nathan said for the third time as they finalized plans. "I won't be alone. I'll have the boys, and we'll have Morrison's daughters checking in every few days. We'll manage, Nathan. You focus on getting those cattle to the fort and securing that contract." Eleanor met his eyes across the table. "This is the piece that makes everything else possible. It has to work." "No pressure," Nathan said dryly, but there was grim determination in his expression. "I'll make it work." The week before the cattle drive passed in frantic preparation, Nathan and Morrison met daily to organize their combined herd, hire drovers they could trust, and plan their route to minimize risks. Eleanor threw herself into stockpiling supplies, baking extra bread that would keep, putting up more preserves, ensuring they had enough to sustain both the household and the drive. The night before Nathan's departure, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She rose quietly and moved to the kitchen, intending to make tea, and found Nathan already there, staring out the window at the dark yard. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "Keep thinking about everything that could go wrong. A stampede, rustlers, early snow in the mountains, the fort canceling the contract when we arrive. 100 different ways this could fail." Eleanor moved to stand beside him. "Or it could go perfectly. You could arrive on time with healthy cattle and a buyer ready to pay. Morrison could become a long-term partner who helps both your ranches succeed. The boys could be so proud of their father they burst." "When did you become such an optimist?" "When I stopped having a choice." Eleanor smiled slightly. "Pessimism is a luxury, Nathan. We can't afford it anymore." He turned to face her, and in the dim light from the banked stove, she could see the worry etched in every line of his face. "If something happens to me out there, if I don't make it back—" "Don't." Eleanor pressed her fingers to his lips. "Don't say it. You're coming back. With money and a contract and stories about the journey. You're coming back because your sons need you and because—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat. "Because?" Nathan prompted gently, catching her hand and holding it against his chest. "Because I need you too," Eleanor admitted. "I know this isn't a real marriage yet. I know we're still figuring out what we are to each other. But Nathan, you've become important to me. Not just as the father of those boys or the man who needed help. You've become important in your own right, and I need you to come back safely." Nathan's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, his eyes never leaving her face. "This wasn't supposed to be complicated," he said softly. "It was supposed to be a practical arrangement. Help with the house and the boys in exchange for security and a place to belong." "I know. But it's become more than that, hasn't it?" "Yes." They stood in the darkness, the admission hanging between them, and Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was dangerous territory, letting herself care this deeply, opening herself to this kind of loss. But it was too late to protect herself now. She'd already crossed that line somewhere between making preserves and fighting bankers and holding this man's hand in the darkness. Nathan released her hand slowly and stepped back, and Eleanor felt the loss like a physical ache. "I should get some sleep," he said roughly. "Early start tomorrow." "Nathan, when I get back," he interrupted, "when the cattle are sold and the payment is made and we know the ranch is safe, then we'll talk about this. About us. But not before. I can't—" His voice cracked. "I can't let myself want something I might not survive to have." Eleanor understood. He was protecting himself, keeping his focus narrow so fear wouldn't paralyze him. It hurt, but she understood. "All right," she said quietly. "When you get back. But Nathan, I'll be here waiting. However long it takes, I'll be here." He nodded once, then disappeared into his room, and Eleanor was left standing alone in the kitchen with her hand still warm from his touch, and her heart aching with words she couldn't yet say. Dawn came too quickly. Eleanor rose to find Nathan already loading supplies onto the wagon, his movements efficient and practiced. The boys stumbled out sleepily to help, and Eleanor prepared a large breakfast, knowing it would be their last meal together for 2 weeks. Morrison arrived just as the sun cleared the horizon, riding at the head of a dozen cattle with 2 hired drovers flanking them. He was a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes, and the same bone-deep weariness Nathan had been carrying. His 3 daughters rode behind on a single horse, all under 10, all watching the proceedings with wide eyes. "Hail!" Morrison greeted, swinging down from his horse. "You ready for this?" "As I'll ever be." Nathan turned to Eleanor and the boys, his face carefully composed. "James, you're the man of the house while I'm gone. Listen to Eleanor, help her with whatever she needs, and keep your brother out of trouble." "Yes, sir," James said, standing straighter. Nathan knelt to Thomas's level. "You be good. Hear me? No wandering off, no taking risks. Stay close to the house and help Eleanor however you can." Thomas nodded solemnly, then threw his arms around Nathan's neck. "Come back soon, Pa." "I will, son. I promise." Nathan held him tightly for a moment, then released him and stood to face Eleanor. For a heartbeat, they just looked at each other, everything they couldn't say hanging in the air between them. Then Nathan reached out and squeezed her hand briefly, his calloused palm rough against hers. "Take care of them," he said quietly. "Take care of yourself," Eleanor countered. "And Nathan, we'll be here when you get back. All of us." He nodded once, then swung onto his horse. Morrison called out to the drovers, and the small group began moving south, driving their combined herd ahead of them. Eleanor and the boys stood watching until they disappeared over a rise, and even then Eleanor strained to catch one last glimpse. "He'll be all right," James said, but his voice was uncertain. "Pa's done cattle drives before." "He will be," Eleanor agreed, wrapping an arm around each boy. "And in the meantime, we have work to do. Come on, those chickens won't feed themselves." They turned back toward the house, 3 people learning to be a family in the absence of the 4th, and Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility settle over her shoulders like a yoke. For the next 2 weeks, these boys were her sole responsibility. The ranch was her sole responsibility. Everything they'd worked for depended on her keeping it all running until Nathan returned. She looked at the boys' faces, determined, frightened, trying to be brave, and felt fierce protectiveness surge through her. They'd fought too hard to fail now. She'd promised Nathan she'd take care of them, and she would. Whatever it took, however hard it got, she would keep this family and this ranch intact until he came home. "All right," she said, injecting confidence she didn't quite feel into her voice. "Let's get to work. We've got 2 weeks to prove we can handle this place on our own." James and Thomas nodded, squaring their small shoulders, and together they walked back to the house as the sun climbed higher and the day's work called to them. Behind them, dust still hung in the air from the departing cattle, and ahead of them stretched 2 weeks of uncertainty and struggle and the constant worry about a man driving cattle through dangerous country. But Eleanor had meant what she'd told Nathan. She would be here when he got back. They all would be. And they would have kept his ranch running, kept his family safe, kept everything he'd built from falling apart. Because that's what you did when you loved someone. The thought stopped Eleanor in her tracks. When you loved someone. Was that what this was? This fierce protectiveness, this desperate need for him to return safely, this ache in her chest at his absence? She looked at the boys chattering beside her about their chores for the day, at the house waiting with its endless demands, at the ranch spreading around them in the morning light. And she realized with startling clarity that yes, that's exactly what this was. Somewhere between the letters that had brought her here and this moment standing in the yard watching her family walk ahead of her, she'd fallen in love. Not just with Nathan, but with all of it. The boys, the ranch, the life they were building together. This wasn't convenience or desperation anymore. This was home. And she'd defend it with everything she had. The first 3 days without Nathan passed in exhausting routine. Eleanor rose before dawn to begin breakfast, supervised the boys through their chores, spent afternoons baking for her standing orders in town, and collapsed into bed each night too tired to do more than worry briefly before sleep claimed her. James threw himself into the work with almost desperate intensity, as if he could single-handedly fill his father's absence. Thomas grew quieter, jumping at unexpected sounds and watching the road constantly. On the 4th morning, Eleanor woke to find frost coating the windows and her breath visible in the cold air. Winter was coming early, and somewhere out there, Nathan was driving cattle through increasingly dangerous weather. She pushed the worry down and focused on building up the fire, on warming the kitchen, on the 100 small tasks that kept a household running. She was kneading bread dough when she heard horses approaching. Through the window, she saw Morrison's 3 daughters riding up on their old mare, the oldest girl managing the reins with practiced competence. Eleanor wiped her hands and went to greet them. "Miss Eleanor," the oldest girl, Sarah, Eleanor remembered, called out as she dismounted. "Ma wanted us to check on you and see if you needed anything." "That's very kind. Come inside and warm up. I have fresh coffee." Eleanor ushered the shivering girls into the kitchen, noting their worn coats and the way the youngest kept her hands tucked under her arms for warmth. "How is your mother managing?" "She's managing," Sarah said diplomatically, which told Eleanor everything about how hard things were at the Morrison Ranch. "But she wanted us to tell you that if you need help with anything heavy, we can send word to our neighbor Mr. Chen. He's offered to check on both places while our fathers are gone." Eleanor filed that information away, grateful for the safety net. The girls stayed for an hour, helping with small tasks and chattering with Thomas, who brightened considerably at having other children around. When they left, Eleanor sent them home with fresh bread and a jar of preserves, ignoring their protests that they couldn't pay. "Your father and mine are partners now," Eleanor said firmly. "That makes us family, and family helps each other." The days blended together in hard work and constant vigilance. Eleanor learned to read the sky for weather changes, to check the stock twice daily, to notice when fences needed mending before they failed completely. James taught her how to handle the rifle Nathan kept above the door, just in case. Thomas showed her which chickens were broody and which paths through the property were safest after dark. They were becoming a unit, the three of them, learning to rely on each other in Nathan's absence. But underneath the routine, anxiety thrummed constantly. Every day without word was another day something could have gone wrong. Stampede, rustlers, injury, 1,000 disasters Eleanor couldn't prevent and couldn't know about. On the 8th day, a rider appeared on the horizon. Eleanor's heart leaped, hoping desperately for news, but as the figure drew closer, she recognized the bank clerk from town. Her stomach dropped. "Mrs. Whitfield," the young man said, dismounting in the yard. "Mr. Winters sent me with a message. He needs to see you in town tomorrow morning. Says it's urgent regarding your account." Eleanor felt ice forming in her chest. "Did he say what about?" "No, ma'am. Just said it was urgent and couldn't wait for Mr. Hale's return." The clerk's face was carefully neutral, but Eleanor caught a hint of sympathy in his eyes. "I'm sorry to bring trouble." After he'd gone, Eleanor stood in the yard trying to control her panic. What could be urgent enough that Winters needed to see her immediately? Had something happened to Nathan? Or was this about their loan, some complication they hadn't anticipated? "Miss Eleanor?" James appeared at her elbow, his face pale. "Is it about Pa?" "I don't know, sweetheart, but I'm going into town tomorrow to find out." Eleanor forced herself to sound calmer than she felt. "I need you to watch Thomas and handle the chores. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." James straightened his shoulders. "But what if it's bad news?" "Then we'll deal with it, together." Eleanor pulled him into a quick hug. "We've come too far to give up now." That night, Eleanor barely slept, running through every possible disaster until her mind spun with exhaustion. When dawn finally came, she dressed in her best outfit, pinned her hair with extra care, and prepared herself for whatever awaited in town. The ride to Sweetwater felt endless. Eleanor rehearsed arguments, prepared explanations, tried to steel herself for the worst. When she finally tied her horse outside the bank and forced herself through the doors, her hands were shaking. Winters looked up as she entered his office, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Whitfield, thank you for coming so promptly. Please, sit." Eleanor sat, her back rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. "Your message said it was urgent." "Indeed." Winters pulled out a telegram and slid it across the desk. "This arrived yesterday from Fort Laramie. I thought you should see it immediately." Eleanor picked up the telegram with numb fingers, her eyes scanning the brief message. Then she read it again, certain she'd misunderstood. "Contract fulfilled? Payment received? Hale and Morrison returning with full amount. Expect arrival 3 days." Relief hit her so hard she felt dizzy. They made it. They sold the cattle. They did indeed. And according to the fort's purchasing agent, they delivered premium stock ahead of schedule. The fort is already requesting first option on their spring calves. Winters actually smiled, a small expression, but genuine. "I'll admit, Mrs. Whitfield, I didn't think they'd pull it off." But they did. Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. They'd done it. Against all odds, through early winter weather and 100 potential disasters, Nathan and Morrison had completed the drive and secured the payment. They were coming home. When they arrive, have them come see me immediately, Winters continued. I'll want to adjust the loan terms now that they've demonstrated viability, assuming they're interested in continuing their partnership arrangement. I believe they will be, Eleanor managed. This has worked well for both families. Good. Then we'll discuss extending the loan at better terms. You've proven yourself, Mrs. Whitfield. Both of you have. Winters stood, extending his hand. I'm not often wrong about people, but I'm glad I was wrong about you. Eleanor shook his hand, still dazed, and somehow made it out of the bank and onto her horse. She rode home in a fog of relief and joy and disbelief, and when she burst into the yard calling for the boys, they came running from the barn. They made it! Eleanor dismounted in a rush, grabbing both boys and spinning them around. Your father made it! He sold the cattle and he's coming home in 3 days! James whooped, and Thomas burst into tears of relief, and they all stood in the yard holding each other and laughing and crying all at once. 3 days. Just 3 more days, and Nathan would be home, safe and successful, and finally free of the worst of the debt that had been crushing him. Those 3 days were the longest of Eleanor's life. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, baked Nathan's favorite foods, ensured every chore was completed perfectly so he'd return to a ranch running smoothly. The boys were equally restless, unable to focus on anything, constantly checking the road for any sign of riders approaching. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, James was the first to spot them. Pa! He shouted from his lookout on the porch. Pa's coming! Eleanor ran outside to see 2 riders approaching at an easy lope, and even from a distance she could see the change in Nathan's bearing. He sat straighter, moved easier, looked like a man who'd shed a crushing weight. Beside him, Morrison was grinning broadly. The boys launched themselves at their father before he'd fully dismounted, nearly knocking him over with the force of their greeting. Nathan caught them both, laughing, and Eleanor felt her heart swell at the sight. This was what she'd been fighting for. This moment of pure joy, this family reunited and whole. Nathan's eyes found hers over the boys' heads, and the look he gave her made her breath catch. It was relief and joy and something deeper, something that made her pulse race. When he finally extracted himself from the boys' embrace and moved toward her, she met him halfway. You made it, she said, her voice unsteady. I made it. He stopped just in front of her, close enough that she could see the dust and exhaustion etched in his face, could smell leather and sage and honest sweat. Eleanor, we did it. The contract, the payment, everything went perfectly. Morrison and I are already planning next year's drive. I know. Winters sent for me. He said, her voice broke. He said you delivered premium stock ahead of schedule, that the fort wants more. We pushed hard to beat the weather, lost 2 head to a river crossing, but the rest arrived in excellent condition. Nathan's hand came up to touch her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I couldn't have done this without you, without knowing you were here, keeping everything together, keeping the boys safe. I couldn't have... Eleanor didn't let him finish. She closed the distance between them and kissed him, pouring every bit of fear and relief and love she'd been holding inside into that single moment. Nathan froze for a heartbeat. Then his arms came around her and he was kissing her back with the same desperate intensity, both of them clinging to each other like drowning people who'd finally found shore. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor became aware of multiple things at once. The boys staring at them with wide eyes and slowly spreading grins. Morrison diplomatically studying the horizon, and her own face burning with a blush that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with joy. Well, Morrison said eventually, his tone carefully neutral, I should get home to my girls. They'll want to know their father didn't get himself killed trying to make an honest dollar. Morrison, Nathan called as the man turned his horse. Thank you for trusting me with this partnership, for taking the chance. Thank your wife, Morrison said with a knowing smile. She's the one who convinced both of us it could work. I'll see you next week to discuss spring planning. After he'd ridden off, Nathan turned back to Eleanor, his hands still resting on her waist. My wife, he repeated quietly. We should probably make that official at some point. Probably, Eleanor agreed, unable to stop smiling. Though I warn you, I'm quite particular about wedding arrangements. I'll want at least 2 witnesses and perhaps even a proper dress. I think we can manage that. Nathan's own smile was soft, transforming his weathered face into something almost boyish. But first, I need to get cleaned up and catch up on 2 weeks of sleep and maybe eat something that wasn't cooked over a campfire. Pa, Miss Eleanor made your favorite stew, Thomas announced, bouncing with excitement. An apple pie. And she kept everything running perfect while you were gone. Did she now? Nathan looked at Eleanor with such warmth in his eyes that she felt heat flood through her. Then I'm a lucky man. They moved toward the house together, and Eleanor noticed the way Nathan's hand found the small of her back, the way his body angled toward hers as they walked. Something fundamental had shifted during their separation. The question marks that had hung over their arrangement had resolved into certainty. They weren't pretending anymore, weren't just partners in saving a ranch. They were building a marriage. That evening, after Nathan had bathed and eaten and the boys had been sent to bed despite their protests, Eleanor and Nathan sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. He'd brought his payment from the cattle sale, $475, his half after expenses. Combined with what they'd saved from Eleanor's enterprises and the payment they'd already made, they had enough for the November payment with money left over. We should go to the bank tomorrow, Eleanor said. Make the payment and discuss the new loan terms Winters mentioned. Tomorrow, Nathan agreed. But tonight, I just want to sit here with you and remember what it feels like to breathe without that weight crushing my chest. Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, and his arm came around her naturally, as if they'd been sitting this way for years instead of days. I was so scared, she admitted quietly. Every day you were gone, I imagined 100 disasters. I kept thinking about having to tell the boys something had happened to you, about losing you right when I'd found you. Nathan's arm tightened around her. I was scared too. Not of the drive or the cattle or even the weather. I was scared of dying before I could come back and tell you. He stopped, struggling with words. I've been alone for 2 years. Alone even when I was surrounded by people, because Sarah was gone and I didn't know how to be anything but alone anymore. And then you showed up and reminded me what it felt like to have a partner, someone to share the weight with, someone to come home to. Nathan, let me finish. He turned to face her, his hand cupping her cheek. I love you, Eleanor Whitfield. I don't know when it happened, maybe when you knelt in the dust to look my boys in the eye on your first day here, or when you stood up to the bank with nothing but determination and a ledger full of numbers, or when you kissed me this afternoon like you'd been waiting your whole life to do it. But somewhere along the way, I fell completely in love with you. And if you'll have me, if you'll take a widowed rancher with 2 boys and a still struggling ranch and 1,000 flaws, I'd like to make this marriage real. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling so hard her cheeks ached. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it, because I love you too, Nathan Hale. I love your boys and your ranch and your stubborn determination to never give up. I love how you fight for your family and how you're learning to ask for help and how you look at me like I'm worth something precious. So yes, I'll marry you properly. I'll be your wife in truth, not just convenience. But Nathan kissed her then, slow and sweet and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both were crying and laughing, giddy with relief and joy and the simple wonder of having found each other against all odds. When? Nathan asked, pressing his forehead to hers. Soon. But first, let's save this ranch completely. Let's make that payment and secure our future. Then we'll have a proper wedding with the boys and the whole town watching, and nobody will have any doubt that we chose this, that we chose each other. The next morning, they rode into town as a family. Nathan and Eleanor in the wagon seat, the boys in the back chattering excitedly about their father's adventure on the cattle drive. At the bank, Winters greeted them with something approaching respect. Mr. Hale, Mrs. Whitfield, I understand you're here to make a payment. Nathan laid the carefully counted bills on Winters' desk, $400 even, with $75 kept back for operating expenses. November payment in full as agreed, with a request to discuss our ongoing business relationship. Winters counted the money with meticulous care, then made notes in his ledger. Your account now shows a balance of $850. Given your demonstrated ability to generate multiple income streams and your successful partnership with Morrison, I'm prepared to offer new terms. 6% interest instead of 8, and I'll restructure the remaining balance into smaller monthly payments over 2 years instead of the balloon payments you've been making. It was better than Eleanor had dared hope. Smaller monthly payments meant less pressure, less risk of catastrophe if one income source faltered. The reduced interest would save them hundreds of dollars over the life of the loan. We accept, Nathan said firmly. With one addition, Eleanor and I would like to formalize our marriage. We'll need witness signatures for the license. Winters actually smiled. I'd be honored to serve as witness. And may I say, Mrs. Whitfield, you've proven yourself a remarkable woman. This town could use more people with your determination. They left the bank with new loan papers, a marriage license, and a sense of accomplishment so profound Eleanor felt lightheaded. They'd done it. They'd actually saved the ranch. The wedding took place the following Saturday in Sweetwater's small church. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress she'd altered to be more festive, with wildflowers in her hair that Thomas had picked that morning. Nathan wore his Sunday best, and the boys stood proudly beside him as witnesses. Morrison and his daughters attended, along with Margaret Hadley and her family, and a surprising number of townspeople who'd heard about the mail-order bride who'd helped save the Hale Ranch. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When the minister asked if Eleanor took Nathan to be her husband, she answered with absolute certainty, her voice carrying through the small church. And when Nathan slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Sarah's wedding ring, which he'd asked the boys' permission to use, Eleanor felt the weight of what they were building settle over her like a blessing. You may kiss your bride, the minister announced, and Nathan did, thoroughly and without self-consciousness, to the delight of the assembled guests and the particularly loud cheering of his sons. The reception was held in the churchyard, with neighbors contributing food and music, and the kind of genuine celebration that only came from people who understood how close the Hale family had come to losing everything. Eleanor found herself passed from conversation to conversation, receiving congratulations and advice and offers of friendship from women she was only beginning to know. But through it all, her eyes kept finding Nathan. He stood with Morrison and a few other ranchers discussing plans for a cooperative of small operations that would share resources and labor. Already he was thinking about the future, about growth and stability, and building something that would last. He looks happy, Margaret Hadley observed, appearing at Eleanor's elbow. First time I've seen Nathan Hale smile like that since Sarah died. He has reason to smile now, Eleanor said. We all do. You know the whole town thought you were crazy when you stayed. Margaret's tone was conversational but honest. Mail-order bride steps off the stage to find 2 barefoot boys and a failing ranch, and she doesn't run? People took bets on how long you'd last. How long did you give me? A week at most, Margaret grinned. I'm glad to have lost that bet. What you've done here, saving this ranch, bringing that family back to life, it gives the rest of us hope. Shows that determination and creativity matter more than starting conditions. As evening fell and the guests began departing, Eleanor found herself on the church steps with Nathan, watching the boys play with the Morrison girls in the last light. They looked like normal children now, laughing and running and carefree in ways they hadn't been when Eleanor first arrived. Thank you, Nathan said quietly, his arm around her waist. For everything, for showing up and staying and fighting when I'd forgotten how, for loving my boys, for loving me. Thank you for taking a chance on a spinster teacher from Boston, Eleanor countered, for letting me be part of something real, for giving me a home. They stood together watching their children play, and Eleanor thought about the letter that had brought her here. That simple correspondent seeking a woman of good character for companionship and household assistance. Neither of them had known what they were really asking for, what they were really offering. But they'd found it anyway, found each other, and built something stronger than either could have managed alone. A month later, Eleanor stood in the ranch house kitchen preparing breakfast and marveling at how normal it had all become. The boys chattered at the table over their morning meal, arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to collect eggs. Nathan came in from the barn with fresh milk, dropping a kiss on Eleanor's cheek as he passed, a casual gesture that still made her heart flutter. The monthly report for the bank sat ready on the desk, showing steady income from multiple sources and consistent progress paying down their debt. Morrison had stopped by twice that week to discuss spring planning, and his daughters had started joining Thomas and James for lessons Eleanor was teaching in the afternoons. The cooperative Nathan had proposed was gaining traction, with 5 small ranches agreeing to share resources and labor. "Ma," Thomas said suddenly, then stopped. He'd been testing the word for a week now, uncertain if it was allowed. "I mean, Miss Eleanor—" "Ma is fine, sweetheart," Eleanor said gently, feeling tears prick her eyes. "If that's what you want to call me." "Can Ma come fishing with us today?" Thomas asked James. "Since we finished all the chores?" James considered this gravely. "Can you bait your own hook, Ma? Because I'm not doing it for you." "I'll bait my own hook," Eleanor promised, laughing, "though I make no guarantees about actually catching anything." Nathan caught her eye across the room, his smile soft and full of love. 2 months ago, they'd been strangers bound by desperation and hope. Now they were a family, imperfect and still struggling sometimes, but real and whole and fighting together. That afternoon, as they walked to the stream with fishing poles and a picnic basket, Eleanor looked at her family and thought about the journey that had brought her here. The losses in Boston, the leap of faith in answering Nathan's letter, the terror and triumph of those first weeks. Every choice had led to this moment, to this place, these people, this life she was building one day at a time. "What are you thinking about?" Nathan asked, falling into step beside her while the boys raced ahead. "About showing up," Eleanor said. "About how the most important thing I ever did was get off that stage and stay." "I'm glad you stayed," Nathan said simply. "Every single day I'm grateful you stayed." "I'm the woman who stayed," Eleanor said, echoing words she'd spoken what felt like a lifetime ago. "And I'm exactly where I belong." They reached the stream to find the boys already setting up their poles, and Eleanor settled onto the bank beside her family, the autumn sun warm on her face and the sound of laughter replacing the silence that had haunted this ranch for too long. There would be more challenges ahead, winter to survive, crops to plant in spring, endless work and occasional setbacks. But they'd face it all together, and that made all the difference. As Thomas let out a whoop at catching his first fish and James rushed to help him land it, Eleanor felt Nathan's hand find hers. She squeezed back, holding tight to this man who'd given her everything by simply giving her a chance. This was home. Not the house or the land or even the ranch itself, but this collection of hearts learning to beat in rhythm, this family built not by blood, but by choice and perseverance and love. Eleanor had come to Wyoming seeking security and found something infinitely more valuable. She'd found belonging. She'd found purpose. She'd found love. And she'd proven that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was simply stay. Stay when others ran. Stay when it was hard. Stay when the outcome was uncertain. Because the best things in life weren't guaranteed or easy or safe. They were earned through showing up, day after day, choosing to fight for what mattered. Eleanor Hale, no longer Whitfield, no longer alone, no longer uncertain, smiled as her son called for her to come see his catch. She rose and joined her family at the water's edge, and in that moment, with the Wyoming wind in her hair and her husband's hand in hers and her children's laughter ringing across the prairie, she knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice. She'd stayed, and in staying, she'd found everything she'd been searching for. She'd found home.